The wind off the Rhine was sharp and cold that morning. Shreds of fog clung to the valley as the US 9th Armoured Division advanced through the shattered town of Remagen, Germany. The air smelled of cordite and wet stone. Artillery echoed from the hills beyond the river, each concussion rolling like thunder through the ruins. Lieutenant Carl H. Timmerman, a 24-year-old from Nebraska, rode in the lead jeep of Company A, 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion. His men were bone-tired. They'd been fighting for days, pushing east through a countryside littered with wrecked trucks, burned-out tanks, and the broken remnants of the German army. The Rhine lay just ahead, the last great barrier to the heart of the Reich. Timmerman's radio crackled. "Recon reports enemy movement near the bridge. Repeat, near the bridge." He looked up sharply. Bridge? That couldn't be right. Every crossing of the Rhine had been blown. Every one. For weeks, the Allies had watched as retreating German forces dynamited their own spans to slow the advance. But then he heard it again. "Bridge at Remagen still stands. I say again, the bridge is still up." The words hit like an electric shock. He turned to his driver. "Step on it." The jeep roared down the muddy road, weaving through craters and debris until the ruins of Remagen came into view. Grey, skeletal buildings scarred by artillery. Beyond them, framed against the morning mist, rose two massive stone towers. Between them stretched an iron colossus of riveted steel, the Ludendorff Bridge, and it was still standing. Timmerman felt his pulse quicken. The span was long and battered, its deck pocked with shell holes and twisted railings, but intact, a miracle of war. He raised his binoculars. On the far bank, he could see German troops, engineers and machine gunners, scrambling around the eastern tower. Smoke curled upward from demolition pits, and something in his gut turned cold. "They're going to blow it," he muttered. He grabbed the radio handset. "All units, this is Timmerman. We've got a bridge over the Rhine. Repeat, bridge intact. We're moving in." The answer came immediately from Major General John W. Leonard, commander of the 9th Armoured Division. "Then take it, Lieutenant. Take that bridge." Timmerman leapt from the jeep, waving his men forward. Sherman tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion rumbled up behind them, treads grinding against cobblestones. The lead tank, Cobra King II, swung its turret toward the bridge and fired a shell. The explosion tore through a German machine gun nest guarding the approach. The sky erupted in return fire. German 20mm cannons from the far bank raked the road, sending tracers whipping past in streaks of orange. The men hugged the ground, crawling through rubble toward the abutment. Above them, shells exploded against the towers, showering them with dust and splinters. Then came the sound they dreaded, a deep, muffled whoomp, followed by a roar. The bridge shook violently. A geyser of smoke and flame shot upward from the center span. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was still there, twisted, burning, but standing. The German demolition charges had failed. Timmerman didn't hesitate. He turned to his platoon sergeant. "We're going across." Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a farm boy from Ohio, grinned through the smoke. "Then let's make history." And with that, the first American soldiers sprinted onto the Ludendorff Bridge, the last unbroken link over the Rhine. The sound of boots against steel echoed like thunder. At 3:50 p.m. on March 7th, 1945, Sergeant Alexander Drabik became the first American to set foot on the Ludendorff Bridge. His squad followed close behind, hunched low, rifles clutched tight. The entire bridge shook under the concussion of German artillery from the far bank. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic stench of burning girders. Drabik's heart pounded as he ran. "Keep moving," he shouted, waving his men forward. Behind them, Lieutenant Carl Timmerman sprinted through the haze, shouting orders over the roar of machine gun fire. Tracer rounds zipped through the latticework of iron, punching holes in the planking. The river below churned, grey and cold, spattered with shrapnel. To their left, an anti-tank gun hidden in the trees fired. Its shells screamed past, exploding near the western tower. Fragments whined through the air like hornets. "Jesus Christ!" one private yelled, diving for cover. "Get up!" Timmerman barked. "You stop now! You die here!" The men surged forward again, slipping across broken timbers, stepping over the bodies of fallen Germans who had died trying to set the last of the charges. Some of the detonators still hung uselessly from the beams, wires dangling like dead vines. The bridge had been partially mined, but poorly, hastily. The blast that should have destroyed it had instead snapped only a few girders. The Americans were running through a miracle, and every German on the far bank was trying to erase it. From the eastern tower, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters of the German 12th Engineer Battalion watched in disbelief. "They're crossing!" he shouted to his men. "They're actually crossing!" He turned to his radio operator. "Tell headquarters, the Americans are on the bridge, now!" But the reply came back garbled, panicked. The German high command had already been thrown into confusion. Nobody had expected an intact crossing at Remagen, least of all Adolf Hitler, who had ordered that every bridge along the Rhine be destroyed. Now, against every probability, one still stood, and the enemy was using it. Peters cursed under his breath and grabbed a rifle. He aimed down the bridge and fired, but the Americans kept coming. Halfway across, Drabic threw himself flat as a shell burst overhead, sending molten fragments raining down. His pack was smoking. "God damn it, I'm too close to quit now," he growled, leaping up and charging the last stretch. At 4 p.m, Drabic and his men reached the far bank. They dove into the ruins of a bombed warehouse and fired back across the river. The first American bridgehead east of the Rhine was secured. Behind them, the rest of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion poured across. 120 men, then 300, then tanks. The first Sherman rumbled onto the bridge, its treads clattering against warped planks. Soldiers winced at every groan of the steel structure. One wrong move, and the entire span could collapse into the river below. But still they went. Major Murray Devers, commanding the armoured column, shouted into his radio, "We're across! The bridge is holding!" On the west bank, soldiers erupted in cheers. They had done the impossible, crossed the Rhine months before the generals had planned to. Yet victory came at a cost. German artillery zeroed in on the span. Shells fell closer and closer, shaking the bridge like a living thing. Timmerman yelled for his men to clear the deck, waving them into the bombed-out buildings of Erpel on the east bank. One blast hit the approach ramp, killing a half-dozen men instantly. Another struck the water, sending a geyser of spray over the crossing. Still, the line of Americans continued. Engineers followed behind, cutting demolition wires and tossing unexploded charges into the river. They worked with steady hands as steel fragments screamed around them. By dusk, nearly 800 troops and several light tanks had crossed. A white star now flew over the east bank of the Rhine, the first Allied banner to do so since Napoleon's time. That night, as the exhausted men dug in, Lieutenant Timmerman stood at the bridgehead and looked back toward the west where the sun was setting behind the spires of Remagen. The bridge was battered, smoking, and barely standing, but it was theirs. He turned to his sergeant. "You realize what we just did?" Drabic grinned, his face blackened with soot. "Yes, sir. We just walked into Germany. March 8th, 1945. Dawn. The Ludendorff Bridge stood against the pale grey sky like a wounded giant. Its iron ribs were twisted and blackened from fire, its deck still smouldering in places. Yet somehow, impossibly, it held. Beneath its skeletal frame, the Rhine flowed dark and cold, the river that had guarded Germany's heart for centuries. On the western bank, columns of American reinforcements lined the roads, stretching as far as the eye could see. Trucks, tanks, and engineers jammed the approach. The bridge creaked under the strain of constant movement, thousands of men and vehicles crossing in a relentless tide. On the far side, in the captured village of Erpel, Lieutenant Karl Timmerman crouched in a shell hole, clutching his field radio. German artillery pounded the hills around him. The bridge had become a bullseye, and the enemy was determined to erase their humiliation. A shell exploded nearby, shaking the ground. "They're zeroing in again," shouted Sergeant Drabick, diving for cover. Timmerman's radio crackled. It was Colonel Leonard Engerman, the regimental commander. "Timmerman, hold that bridgehead. Reinforcements are coming. Engineers are working to reinforce the structure. Don't let them drop it." "Yes, sir," Timmerman replied, his voice steady despite the chaos. Behind him, combat engineers from the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion crawled along the bridge's underside, bolting steel plates and welding shattered beams, all while shells screamed overhead. They worked with a calm born of desperation, balancing on narrow girders above the icy current. Every tremor, every sound of metal groaning under strain made their stomachs twist. A corporal shouted, "Captain, this thing's going to come down." "Not today it isn't," his officer replied. They reinforced every joint they could reach, patching the wounded bridge like battlefield surgeons. Meanwhile, miles away in Berlin, the news hit Hitler's headquarters like a thunderclap. The Führer's face turned purple with rage as reports arrived from the Western Front. "They crossed the Rhine?" he roared, slamming his fist on the map table. "How could they cross the Rhine?" No one dared answer. The officer responsible for the defense of the Remagen sector, General Major Richard von Bothmer, was arrested on the spot. So were the engineers who had failed to destroy the bridge. In the coming days, several would be tried by court-martial and executed by firing squad, scapegoats for what Hitler called a betrayal of the Reich. But even as the Germans sought to punish, they scrambled to react. Orders went out to destroy the bridge at all costs. By the next morning, German artillery batteries lined the eastern hills, joined by 88mm anti-aircraft guns now trained on the span. The Luftwaffe launched desperate airstrikes, jet-powered Mi-262s, and lumbering Arado, R-234 bombers swooped low, dropping their payloads in vain. American anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts tracing patterns over the river. At noon, a formation of Arado bombers released their ordnance directly over the bridge. The ground heaved. One bomb struck near the center span, blowing a crater in the deck and killing 2 engineers instantly. Yet the structure held. Below, men cheered through their exhaustion. Sergeant Drabick crossed himself. "You can't kill this thing," he muttered. "She's blessed." But blessed was not how it felt to the men guarding it. Every hour, shells screamed in from across the river. Smoke and fire turned the air into a suffocating haze. Engineers patched holes faster than the enemy could make them. By nightfall, the entire valley glowed red with artillery fire. Still, the bridge refused to die. Across the river, in a command post dug into the hillside, General Walter Boch of the German L7th Corps stared through his field glasses at the span. He could hardly believe his eyes. "Why is it still standing?" he demanded. "American engineers, sir," his aide replied. "They're reinforcing it as fast as we hit it." Boch lowered the binoculars, silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Then it's already over." He was right. Every minute the Ludendorff Bridge remained standing was a dagger in the Reich's heart. American divisions poured across faster than the Germans could respond. Within 24 hours, the Allies had ferried 8,000 troops and 40 tanks into the bridgehead. By March the 10th, that number had tripled. What began as a daring assault had become a flood, a river of men and steel pouring into Germany itself. That night, under the cover of darkness, Sergeant Drabick stood on the bridge and looked down at the swirling Rhine. The moonlight shimmered off the water like silver. He could still hear the distant thunder of artillery, but for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel it. Hope. He turned to Lieutenant Timmerman beside him. "You think we'll make it home after this, sir?" Timmerman smiled faintly. "If that bridge can hold, Sergeant, maybe we all can." March 10th, 1945. Remagen, Germany. The Ludendorff Bridge was more steel skeleton than structure now. Its girders were twisted, its decking cratered by bombs, and entire sections of railing hung into the river like torn sinew. Yet, incredibly, it still carried the weight of America's advance into the heart of Germany. The 9th Armoured Division's bridgehead east of the Rhine had grown into a fortress. Tanks rumbled through the narrow streets of Erpel, their engines rumbling in unison with the constant thunder of artillery. Engineers had built bunkers in basements, strung barbed wire across alleys, and dug foxholes into the frozen earth. Above them, the Luftwaffe returned in desperate waves. Messerschmitt 262s, sleek and silver, screamed down the valley at supersonic speeds, streaking past tracer fire and dropping bombs that splashed harmlessly into the river. The American anti-aircraft crews on the West Bank barely paused between reloads, their 40mm Bofors guns hammering until barrels glowed red. Corporal Joseph Delisle, one of the engineers working the bridge, remembered later, "You didn't think. You just kept patching. Every time a bomb hit, we'd throw down another plate, weld it, and move on. It was like trying to fix a roof in the middle of a thunderstorm, and the thunder never stopped." By March 11th, the First Army under General Courtney Hodges had poured more than 25,000 troops across the river. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, and even artillery pieces crossed in a near-continuous stream. A temporary pontoon bridge had begun construction downstream, but the battered Ludendorff was still the lifeline, the miracle that made it all possible. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was now little more than a ghost of the man who had first run across the bridge 3 days earlier. His uniform was blackened with smoke, his voice hoarse from shouting over gunfire. He hadn't slept since the assault, yet every time someone told him to rest, he'd shake his head and say, "Not while she's still standing." At noon, a courier arrived from the division headquarters carrying news that rippled through the ranks. General Eisenhower himself had been informed of the crossing. The Supreme Commander had sent back only 4 words. "Hold that bridgehead tight." So, across the river, in Berlin, Hitler's rage had turned murderous. He had ordered Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, to retake or destroy the bridge at all costs. Jet bombers, V-2 rockets, frogmen, and even suicide squads were thrown into the attempt. On March 12th, the German Navy's Special Operations Unit, Kleinkampfverbände, launched an attack using miniature one-man submarines called Neggers. Under cover of night, they crept down the Rhine toward the bridge, but the current was too strong. Every one of them was either swept away or destroyed before reaching their target. The next day, V-2 rockets screamed down from the stratosphere, the first ballistic missiles ever used in warfare. Aimed at the bridge, they fell miles short, slamming into nearby hillsides and villages, killing civilians, but leaving the Ludendorff untouched. An Allied war correspondent watching from the West Bank wrote, "It is as if the bridge itself refuses to die." But it could not last forever. By March 14th, cracks were spreading through the steel arches. Engineers crawled along the beams, listening to the ominous groan of metal under strain. The entire structure swayed slightly with every passing truck. They begged commanders to restrict traffic, but the orders were clear. The bridge would carry men and supplies until the very last moment. Sergeant Drabick, standing near the western tower, looked up at the trembling girders. "She's given us everything she's got," he said quietly. At 3 p.m. on March 17th, 12 days after the first crossing, the miracle ended. Without warning, a deep, wrenching sound tore through the air, a metallic shriek that silenced even the artillery. The bridge shuddered violently. Men on deck dropped their gear, staring in disbelief as the center span began to buckle. "Run!" someone screamed. The Ludendorff bridge folded in on itself with a roar like thunder. Massive girders twisted and snapped, plunging into the Rhine below. Clouds of smoke and dust engulfed both banks. When the air cleared, the mighty bridge was gone, swallowed by the river it had defied. 31 US engineers died in the collapse. Dozens more were wounded. But by then, the damage was done. To Germany. Because even without the bridge, the Allies had already built new pontoon spans across the Rhine. The gateway was open. The river, once Germany's last defense, had been breached. In the aftermath, American soldiers stood on the riverbank, staring at the empty space where the bridge had stood. Sergeant Drabick removed his helmet and whispered, "She did her job." Lieutenant Timmerman nodded. "And she made history, Masem." Within weeks, the Allies would surge across the Rhine in force, surrounding the Ruhr and marching toward Berlin. The war in Europe had entered its final chapter, all because one bridge, meant to be destroyed, had refused to fall. Years later, when veterans returned to the quiet town of Remagen, they found only stone towers on either side of the river, silent sentinels watching over the water. Between them, the Rhine flowed as it always had. But for 12 unforgettable days in 1945, that river had carried the weight of destiny, and one broken bridge had changed the course of a world at war.